So this is going to be the fourth and concluding lecture for Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard. And we are going to begin today's lecture with a thought experiment. So what is a thought experiment? A thought experiment is a hypothetical situation in which a theory or a hypothesis or a principle is laid out for the purpose of thinking through its consequences. So you are going to imagine a scenario and then we are going to see what this scenario leads us to deduce, right? So in today's concluding lecture, we are going to begin by doing that, by beginning with a thought experiment. So here goes. Imagine you are writing the script for a movie set in the 18th century. Any movie which is set, the surroundings of which are in the 18th century. And one scene of that movie for which you are writing a script is set outside a village, far from the city. Now, the characters in that script are all yours. You are going to decide the names of the characters and everything. You will give them the type of character they are going to have. You're going to give them personality. Those are all yours, right? The plot is also yours. You have the plot in your mind, but you are unable to write, right? This is the situation in the thought experiment. But what could be the reason? The characters are all yours. You are the one who is going to decide the plot. You are the one who is going to decide what happens in the narrative, right? But why are you still unable to write? Well, there may be quite a few reasons, but for the purposes of today's lecture, we are going to look at one of these reasons. So one reason may be that you don't have a proper idea of the setting, of the imagery, or of the scenery, or even better, even easier perhaps, of the landscape. So imagine you have been given the duty to write the script, or maybe you are being paid to write the script of that movie set in the 18th century. But even though you know the characters, even after knowing the story itself, which you will decide, even after the characters depending on you, you are unable to imagine the scene itself. And if you can't imagine the scenes, how will the actions in your text take place, in your script or in your novel or whatever else you are writing? So what do? So some of you will say, sir, this is very easy. I'll just watch another movie set in the 18th century and that will give me an idea of what the scene looks like. Well, that's probably correct. Now ask yourself, how did the script writer of that movie, which you are referring to, which you will use as a reference to write your script, where did the script writer of that movie get the imagery from? Now, this is particularly important. This question is particularly important because in the 18th century, no one had cameras, right? There were no movie cameras, there were no photographs. So obviously, the script writer who you are referring to, whose movie you will watch and then consult and use it to write your own script, where did he get the imagery from, right? Obviously, since there are no cameras, there are no photographic instruments, those don't apply. So where did the script writer of that movie get his imagery from? Well, this brings us to the subject we deal with, that is literature, or if you want to speak of it more broadly, to art. And this is how we are going to enter into Gray's text for today's lecture. So some of the time you have paintings to refer to, right? So for 18th century, you'll find tons of paintings. You'll find maybe 50,000 paintings to refer to. But of course, you certainly don't have paintings for all the landscape in the world from the 18th century, right? This brings us even closer to what we study, very specifically literature. So in the absence of photographs and videos and even paintings for that matter, you have to rely on literature, right? Now, of course, you could go to a museum, but I don't think any of you have any ambition of being archaeologists, right? And well, museums will give you a different sort of idea of what a specific time period in history looked like. So anyway, in light of what I just said, that is, in light of how literature serves as a historical record, we will look into specific portions of Gray's poem. I'm going to tell you, which lines I'm talking about. I'm not going to read all the lines for this lecture, but I'm going to tell you which lines I'm referring to and since you surely have the text, you will be able to pinpoint what those lines actually talk about. So we are going to look into specific portions of Gray's text, particularly when we study the landscape of Thomas Gray's famous elegy. So now we'll be just talking about some of those lines instead of reading them, and let's begin. So the first three stanzas, that's lines 1 to 12, provide the scene for a private and quiet meditation. Now, when I say meditation, please don't visualize a sadhu sitting in a pranayam pose, right? When I say meditation, I'm referring to the practice where someone tries to focus the mind on a particular object, thought, or activity. Just that. So here, our hero, Mr. Thomas Gray, is at a country churchyard, basically in a rural scene. And the scene is clearly beautiful, right? And Gray reveals that this day also passes away just like any other day, as the plowman walks towards his home, and all that, right? I'll just give you a glimpse of these 12 lines. I guess I'll just read the first 12 lines for you. So the first three stanzas go: the curfew tolls the knell of parting day, the lowing herd wind slowly over the lea, the ploughman homeward prods his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness and to me. So remember the centrality of the me, as I have discussed in the previous lectures. Okay, the second stanza. Now fades the glimmering landscape on the sight, and all the air a solemn stillness holds. Save where the beetle wheels his droning flight, and drowsy tinklings lull the distant folds. Save that from yonder ivy-mantled tower the moping owl does to the moon complain, of such as wandering near her secret bower molest her ancient solitary reign. So you see, he's describing the scenery, right? And as I was just telling you, these lines, stanzas 1 to 3 or lines 1 to 12, here you get to see Thomas Gray at a country churchyard, basically, as I said, in a rural setting, right? And he has already mentioned it's a country churchyard, so obviously it's a rural setting. And the scene is obviously very serene and beautiful. And Gray reveals once again that this day too, the day which he is currently living, also passes away just like every other day, right? As the ploughman walks towards his home like the day before and will continue to do the day after. Next, he creates this melancholic scene by talking about the stillness and peaceful environment of the churchyard, which is punctuated by the tinkling of the cattle who have returned home, right? Then the drone of the beetle and the sound of the owl from the church tower. These are all mentioned in the lines that I just read to you. So in the first three stanzas, he paints a kind of gyroscopic picture of the scenery that surrounds him. Okay, so some of you may not be familiar with the word gyroscope, and I'll take a moment to explain what that means. So almost all of you use smartphones, I'm sure. Some of you may be aware that your phones have this little device inside called a gyroscope. Now, basically, a gyroscope is a device used for measuring or maintaining orientation. So, a gyroscope in your smartphone enables it to sense the orientation of the phone to auto-rotate your screen, right? So, for example, when you flip the phone and the screen automatically rotates, the phone is being able to do so because it has the gyroscope inside it, right? Now, why am I bringing the smartphone imagery while talking about Thomas Gray? Well, the reason is, in Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, Thomas Gray paints nothing short of a gyroscopic or very detailed picture of the scenery that surrounds him. So essentially, I'm trying to tell you that he paints a very, obviously he's not literally painting, but he describes a very detailed imagery of where he's looking from, right? So wherever he is, that is in the country churchyard, everything that he can see or hear, he gives you a detailed account of. Hence, I use that phrase, he paints a gyroscopic picture. So in the next four stanzas, that is lines 13 to 28, we'll see many more important images and symbols, right? Like the strength of elms and the graves of the forefathers, which are comforted by the shade of the yews, and so on and so forth. So, how about I'll just go ahead and read some of these lines and then um, come back to the lecture proper, and then I'll talk about some of those things. So, lines 13 to 28 go as follows. Beneath those rugged elms that yew trees shade, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap, each in his narrow cell forever laid, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. The breezy call of incense breathing morn, the swallow twittering from the straw built shed, the cock's shrill clarion, or the echoing horn, no more shall rouse them from their lowly bed. For them, no more the blazing heath, sorry, for them no more the blazing hearth shall burn, or busy housewife ply her evening care. No children run to lisp their sire's return, or climb his knees the envied kiss to share. Oft did the harvest to their sickle yield, their furrow oft the stubborn glebe has broke. How jocund did they drive their team afield, how bowed the woods beneath their sturdy stroke. So, as I was saying, we see several more important images from lines 13 to 28. Some of these are images, some of these are metaphors or symbols. For example, the strength of the elms and the graves of the forefathers, which he talks about, right, who are lying there in their graveyards and obviously will never, come up from there, right, except in some imaginary world about which Thomas Gray, importantly, is not talking about, right? That is a subject reserved for Mary Shelley. Anyway, so Thomas Gray also reveals the nature of the lives of lower class people who wake up to the song of birds and enjoy hard work. That is the simple pleasures of life, unlike the lives of rock stars or celebrities. So the poet's idea, Thomas Gray's idea, is that to these country folk, death simply means the end of the simple pleasures of life, right? They do not make much hoo-ha about death. They do not, death does not become an issue, right? Now, in the next four stanzas, that is lines 29 to 44, the speaker tells the upper class people who are ambitious, who have majesty, supremacy, aristocracy, and pride, not to mock these poor rustic people for their simplicity. Let's go ahead and have a look at lines 29 to 44. Here goes. Let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur hear with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth ever gave, awaits like the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. Nor you, ye proud, impute to these the fault, if memory over the tomb no trophies raise, where, through the long drawn aisle and fretted vault, the pealing anthem swells the note of praise. Can storied urn or animated bust back to its mansion call the fleeting breath? Can honor's voice provoke the silent dust, or flattery soothe the dull cold year of death? So you see, as I was saying, in these lines, the speaker tells the upper class people who are ambitious, who have majesty, who believe themselves to be supreme, who are possibly aristocratic, and sometimes ambitious and proud. Thomas Gray tells them not to mock these poor rustic people for their simplicity. Why so? Why not? Thomas Gray's theory of death is that ultimately it does not matter what splendor or greatness someone may attain or how decorative their gravestone or tomb is. because they will die just like the poor. So, you see, just to quote those lines again, lines 33 to 36, the boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth ever gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory but lead to the grave. So you see, he's essentially telling the rich and the glorious and aristocratic and upper class people that no matter what you do in your lives, in the end, it's not going to be any different for you than the poor person whose grave does not is not even decorated properly, or whose grave is laden with spelling mistakes, whose tomb engraving is laden with spelling mistakes. So you are not really any superior to that person, because in death you are all equal, right? So I hope you are able to make a very important distinction here, and this is something I have mentioned in the previous lectures as well. Remember that Thomas Gray is mourning the poor ordinary people, obscure people, unknown people whom no one knows, about whom there are no books written, about whom you won't find mentions in any history books, right? But maybe a bit for Thomas Gray. Thomas Gray is making a very important point here, right? And a few moments ago, I brought in the reference of celebrities or rock stars, and I'm going to explain why. So you will see, when celebrities die, hundreds will lament, right? This is a cultural thing, people do it, it's a fact. For example, I remember when Steve Jobs died, and even when David Bowie, who's a musician, he died, thousands of people across the globe were lamenting, crying, doing all sorts of stuff, right? Now compare that to the type of lament here that Thomas Gray is doing. It's a lament for insignificant people, right? Remember the difference I mentioned between a classical elegy and a romantic elegy in the previous two lectures. So in a classical elegy, the lament is for a king, queen, or a very important person, like Steve Jobs or David Bowie. In a romantic elegy, however, the lament is perhaps for a friend, an acquaintance, an ice cream seller maybe, right? Or even more insignificant people, farmer, plowman, who no one knows about. So our hero, Mr. Gray, takes it even several steps further. He will lament for ordinary people who have no epitaphs written on their gravestone. These are people he doesn't even know personally. In fact, you will see later in the poem that he actually has no idea who he is lamenting about, right? Now, in romantic poetry, as you must already know, that is pretty cool. In classical literature, however, such a theme would be laughed at. So here, you need to make note of the difference between these two fundamentally opposing forces of art, classical and romantic. Now, the following lines, lines 45 to 76, have a bit of contemporary political commentary. Now, in a regular class, I would ask you what you know about the political scenario of the time when the poem was written. Now, if I do that in a recorded class, it will unleash all hell. So I'll just give you a hint, and you can find out the rest online, right? Do the rest as your homework. So the poem was written around 1750. As you know, it was written for several years, but around 1750 or 51, check on the date, the poem was published, right? After being written for quite some time. Now, this was a time when the steam engine had already been invented and the industrial revolution was well under its way. This is something I had mentioned in the previous lecture as well, that during Thomas Gray's time, the industrial revolution was only starting, only gearing up, right? And it reaches a degree of culmination when William Blake writes or when Wordsworth writes, right? But Thomas Gray, who is like 40 years or 40 to 45 years senior to Wordsworth, Blake, Coleridge, so he's writing, when he's writing, the industrial revolution is at its kind of infancy, and this industrial revolution brought in a lot of wealth, as you know, but it also divided society further, because people who were already rich landowners now became factory owners and badly exploited the poor who had no land previously. And now, since they had no land previously, they could not build factories there, and when they had no land, they used to work for, they used to work as peasants in the farmhouses of these rich landowners. And now, when the rich landowners had become factory owners, those poor people, previously landless, now they have to work in even more difficult circumstances in those factories. So you will see much of romantic literature dealing with this issue, right? Anyway, throughout Europe, there was a growing sense of anger against this rich aristocratic ruling class, and this factor is brought into play in this poem as well. So, Gray's fundamental message of the poem: all the people, even the poor, are born with equal natural capacities. If they are given suitable opportunity and encouragement, then they too can prove themselves to be as good as the upper class. Now remember that Thomas Gray, perhaps in a very uncanny manner, or you may call it foreshadowing, um, now this anger that was developing against the rich aristocratic society, that unleashed eventually during the French Revolution, right? And I'm sure you all have an idea of how deadly that was, right? Um, so yes, perhaps Thomas Gray does anticipate that sometime in the past, these poor people who are being oppressed so much that they are going to rise up one day, and which is why he makes it a point to tell the rich people, to the upper class, that there is no reason for you to think that you are superior in any way, right? Because ultimately you will end up in the grave too, just like the poor person who has ended up in the grave, who may not have his tombstone very well decorated, but in the end it does not matter. Now, next, from lines 77 to 92, the poet seems to be touched by the shared humanity of the poor people of the countryside, right? And actually this continues in the in the later sections of the poem as well, but in these lines 77 to 92, he tries to show us, the readers, the beauty in the misspelled inscriptions on the tombstones, some unpolished and consoling biblical verses, and poorly decorated shapeless sculpture, right? I'm again talking about the tombstone of the poor people who have died. Like I mentioned previously, that their tombstones do not look glamorous. Sometimes they have no engravings at all, but when they do, sometimes they are misspelled. But Thomas Gray says, even if they are not decorated, even if the inscriptions themselves are misspelled, there is beauty in them too. So again, try to think of the example I gave you earlier of the death of Steve Jobs on the one hand, and as compared to the death of an ice cream seller on the other hand. Now, when richer people can afford to show their affluence and wealth, the poor can't. Naturally, the rich person's grave would probably be very well decorated with excellent, I don't know what kind of decoration goes into tombstones, but surely the poor can't afford any of it. And while the rich can afford to have good looking tombs sculpted, the poor can't even afford that. Now the larger point here, right, this is the general point, the larger point here is that it simply does not matter, because as Thomas Gray has pointed out, death is the great leveler. And here you can see that the poem has become philosophical. So in the next lines, that is around line 93 to 116, the poem goes through a major transformation. And you will see a transition where it seems that Gray is addressing himself when he writes. This is something I have again mentioned in the previous lectures, that in the romantic elegy, in the tradition which Gray started, he makes himself the center of the poem rather than all the people who have died, who have passed away. So from here you will see, from here meaning from lines 93, you will see how Gray makes himself the center of the poem. And specifically from line 98, Gray imagines an old farmer who is termed as a hoary-headed swain. Now in Gray's imagination, as he mentions in the poem, the farmer describes Gray as a man who does not fit either the upper class or the lower class of society. So let's take a look at the lines for a moment, right? Lines from 93 to 116. Let's read them. Okay. For thee, who mindful of the unhonored dead, dost in these lines their artless tale relate, If chance by lonely contemplation led, some kindred spirit shall inquire thy fate. Haply some hoary-headed swain may say, oft have we seen him at the peep of dawn. The him here is Thomas Gray. Oft have we seen him at the peep of dawn, brushing with hasty steps the dews away to meet the sun upon the upland lawn. There at the foot of yonder nodding beech, that reaches its old fantastic roots so high, his listless length at noontide would he stretch, and pour upon the brook that babbles by. Hard by yon wood, now smiling as in scorn, muttering his wayward fancies he would rove, now drooping, woeful man, like one forlorn, or crazed with care, or crossed in hopeless love. One morn I missed him on the customed hill, along the heath and near his favourite tree. Another came, nor yet beside the reel, nor up the lawn, nor at the wood was he. The next, with dirges die in sad array, slow through the churchway path we saw him borne. Approach and read, for thou canst read the lay, graved on the stone beneath yon aged thorn. So, as I was saying, coming back to the lecture, as I was saying, in these lines, the Thomas Gray imagines a farmer who describes him, that is Thomas Gray, as a man who does not fit either into the upper class or the lower class of society. And according to this imaginary farmer who is talking about Thomas Gray, Gray is a wanderer, a flaneur of sorts, who rests below the tree and watches the brook. He is like a nomad or a madman. He meets all the qualities that the contemporaries of his thought were required to be a poet. And in the poet's imagination, that is, in Thomas Gray's imagination, the farmer also says that he has seen Gray's funeral in the same churchyard where the poem is set. Right? So, in a very strange way, the elegy is also about Thomas Gray's anticipation of his own death and what he wants the world to think of him. So the old man or the old farmer in his imagination is a symbol of what Gray wishes the world to see him as. Right? So finally, the last three stanzas of the poem are the epitaph. Right? That is from lines 117 to the last line, that is line 128 of the poem. Here, in these lines, in the epitaph, the poet declares his grave is upon the lap of Mother Earth. He justifies his life as worthwhile, as he was generous and sincere. So, the last few stanzas of the poem are entirely about Gray himself, about Thomas Gray lamenting his own death in the future. So, overall, as I end this lecture, I will leave you with the thought, I will tell you to think of all the features of the elegy we studied in our previous lectures and today as well, and you should have a more or less holistic picture of the poem, the poet, and the times and landscape in which the poem was written. Further, you should have gained a proper understanding of the differences between the classical elegy and the romantic elegy, and specifically in the context of this poem, you should be able to see how Thomas Gray makes himself the center of the poem, while also talking about the deceased in a very sympathetic or rather empathetic manner, right? So that ends our lectures on Thomas Gray, and with this we have also completed the CC8 paper.